So that was second edition. It came out in 1989, and it was basically just a way to reorganize all the information in first edition. There were definitely designers at TSR that wanted to make a new game, that wanted to throw out all that kind of cobbled together design that had accumulated through the 70s and 80s and have a real new game that was more systemic and robust. But management overruled the designers, and management said, we don't really want to alienate all the retailers who have all of this product, all of this AD&D product in the channel, adventures and supplements. And if we come out with a new game, we would basically be telling the retailers, hey, all that product you have on your shelves is now useless. So the mandate for second edition was make a revised version of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that is essentially as backward compatible as possible. And they succeeded, because my friends and I played second edition for its entire life. And the entire time we were always able to go back and grab any old adventure from the 70s or 80s and run it basically as is. And that shows you how small a change second edition was. It was really just a way of reorganizing all the information from first edition. Hey everybody, this is Matt Colville, and this is the 8th in the History of D&D series, One Fighter at a Time, where we go through every major edition and a lot of the, what I call like patches that they released to the game starting in 1974. There's a playlist linked below, and we'll probably put a card up if we can figure that out. But this isn't the second edition video. This is a third edition video. But before we get to third edition, I want to talk about what happened to second edition during its life. This was the first edition of the game that my friends and I were playing D&D when it came out. So we all remember this very distinctly. And I don't remember if we were disappointed that it wasn't more different. Probably not. But almost immediately, almost as soon as this comes out in 1989, they started patching it. And I think it was their attempt, maybe mostly Steve Winter, who was the editor for second edition, their attempt to kind of turn second edition into the game they would have made if they could have made a game from scratch. So the same year this comes out, we get a book called The Complete Fighter, and it was the first in a quite long series of handbooks. And they had these interesting, this isn't a great photograph of it, but they had these great kind of faux leatherette covers with gold embossment on it. So the game hadn't been out very long when they almost immediately started patching it. And what you get in the Complete Fighter's handbook is you get a bunch of really interesting new rules, lots of optional combat rules, very meaty and, very robust. And I don't know how popular these were because they're all optional rules. So I think every table was sort of pulling from this crazy list of new abilities, including stuff like called shots, which, they had been trying to avoid doing for a long time, and melee maneuvers. But the thing that got the most attention from these handbooks, starting here in The Complete Fighter, is the kits for your characters. And this is a good reason to kind of go back through the history of this game, because kits basically turned into prestige classes for third edition. Every class would get a bunch of different kits. They are ways to customize your character beyond just being a fighter. So you can see all the different types of quote unquote warrior kits. Remember, in second edition, the fighter was a type of warrior. They had these four archetypal different classes. I think it was warrior, priest, rogue, and mage. And then like a fighter was a type of warrior. A wizard was a type of mage. And that was an organizational tool that let them do all sorts of interesting things by saying, this kit is available to all warriors. So it didn't matter if you were a ranger or a barbarian or a fighter, you could use any of these warrior kits. And a kit, I was not a huge fan of these. I don't really know. None of my friends, let's put it this way, none of my friends and none of the groups that I played with or encountered really ever dug into kits. Because if you see here's the Amazon, right? And the Amazon starts with just an enormous amount of descriptive text, which is not really what we wanted. We wanted crunch, and there's tons of crunch in this book, but it's all optional rules for combat. Whereas here we're just reading a lot about the idea of Amazons, which I sort of feel like we already know what Amazons are, don't we? And look how it just continues. And then we get stuff like secondary skills and weapon proficiencies. And these are all just advice. These are all just, here's some things you could pick to be an Amazon, right? And that's, a little kind of a letdown. just saying, hey, if you want to play an Amazon, choose these things, or Amazons have to use these weapons as opposed to those weapons. Well, okay. But none of those weapons are new or very interesting. And then you get the special benefits. And this is what made the class interesting. These are unique abilities that only an Amazon get. But if you read this special ability, it's pretty crazy, right? You get a bonus to attack and damage when you're fighting male enemies who don't know what an Amazon is, which is so ultra niche and precise that you wouldn't see these abilities like this much moving forward as this series continued. And there were more, the complete wizard books and stuff like that. These abilities, I think, would get broader and more useful until eventually they were hugely broken, was the impression some of my friends and I had. Although you'll see people in the comments of this video who remember these books, and they will be happy to correct me if my memory of this stuff is wrong, because I was, this was 30 years ago. I was in my early 20s. So yeah, this idea that, oh yeah, you're an Amazon, so you get this bonus to hit and damage, but only on your first blow, because they don't expect you as a woman to be as powerful a warrior as you are. And after your first attack, they have figured out that you are a serious fighter and you no longer get that bonus. So it's only on the first attack, and it's only against a male opponent, and it's only against a male opponent who is not familiar with you personally or female warriors in general. That is so ultra precise, but it's also trying to model this narrative idea. The problem is, of course, that it just makes everyone playing an Amazon constantly asking the dungeon master, hey, is this shambling mound male or female? Because if it's male, I get a bonus, presuming that it doesn't know what an Amazon is. And that kind of just constantly pestering the dungeon master and just always seeking after these ultra niche opportunities to use your one special ability it's kind of a downer. And so you wouldn't see anything like this by the time third edition comes along. But here's the interesting thing to me as a designer, right? This benefit makes, even as niche and as weird as this is, this benefit makes your Amazon fighter better than any other fighters who are not using kits. And that's the thing about this design, is it's optional. And since it's optional, they had to find a way to balance it so people using these options would not be overpowered compared to people who just didn't want to use them. They were not required. It's not like you had to choose a kit. And so the way they do that is they give you a penalty. You get a special benefit and a hindrance. And the idea is that these will balance each other out. So if you're using a kit and I'm not, and we're at the same table, our characters are balanced, because yeah, you get a benefit, but you have to deal with this penalty. And of course, the penalty is you suffer a -3 reaction roll adjustment. Reaction is literally like, how do people react to you? How do NPCs treat you when they meet you? So they treat you worse if you're in a male-dominated society. And of course, the reaction adjustment idea is cool, but it was a very kind of broad and limited mechanic to govern all kinds of social interaction. So I don't remember people using reaction adjustments much. So this is the first kind of patch to second edition where we introduce kits that let you customize your characters. And I remember people kind of going kit hunting, right? Because they're looking, every time there was a new one of these books, what everyone wanted to know was, what are the special benefits my character gets? How does this actually help me in combat? If it's a game about fighting monsters, how does a barbarian fight monsters differently than a beast rider? And yeah, there are players, I think maybe even most players, who they start with the fantasy. They see quote unquote beast rider and they imagine something in their mind, and that's what draws them to the kit. But at the end of the day, what they want is they want special abilities. They want game mechanics that support the fantasy they have in their head. And if they don't, then they won't use these kits. So this series of books was very popular, and it would continue. And in fact, they would expand it to include stuff like, the complete book of Celts, if you wanted to run a Celtic campaign, the complete book of castles, if you just want. And this was a big part of the 90s, was that industry, which I think is not as prevalent now as it was before, of people who just buy these books to read them. So a complete book of Celts makes total sense because, you may never run, you may live in the middle of, Nebraska and you don't know anyone who plays this game. You wish you did. And since you can't play it because there wasn't the internet and you couldn't really get together with people online, you would buy these books and you would read them. And that's probably a big part of why like the Amazon is 80% descriptive text about what an Amazon is, and then a handful of actual useful abilities. But they didn't stop with these books. They actually went one step much, much further. And this is the real patch to second edition. This is the first in a series of player option books. Again, this isn't a great photograph. It's nowhere near as dark in real life. The first one's called Skills and Powers. And these were hardcover books, unlike the Complete Fighter, the Complete series. These were all soft covers. These were hardcover books, and they drastically expanded the mechanical options that you had. And this was a real 2.5. And this isn't the 2.5 video. We're not going to go over all these books because largely I'm not sure how popular these were. I'm not sure this is really what people wanted from a 2.5, because what these books did was they took an already pretty crunchy game full of abstruse, unrelated mechanics that had been cobbled together in the 70s and then just reorganized in the late 80s, and they made them much more complex. So for instance, they added ability sub-scores, right? You no longer just have strength. Your strength now has two parts to it. You have your stamina and your muscle. You no longer just have dexterity, you have aim and balance. And so already very weirdly designed stats, strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, became even stranger. And when I say these stats were already strange before this patch came out, this is what I mean. And this is why this is relevant to a third edition video, even though right now we're still talking about second edition. Like, this will be very strange to those of you who only know fifth edition, or really if you've only played D&D in the last 20 years, this may be very strange to you. But these are two different stats from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition. Let's compare our strength and our dexterity. And let's imagine we had a 16 in both. Well, what does a 16 strength get me? Well, look, these are the actual terms they used. You have your hit probability, and you get no bonus to that, right? Your likelihood of hitting goes up by nothing. And then you have your damage adjustment, which goes up by +1. So we just think of to hit and to damage, or a hit bonus and a damage bonus. But they actually use the term hit probability and damage adjustment. I don't know why they thought it was important to use two entirely different ways of describing what is essentially the same bonus. They could have said hit adjustment, damage adjustment, but no, had to be hit probability, damage adjustment. And notice, these aren't the same number. You had to get strength 17 before you got +1/+1. And that was weird and crazy. And then your strength also had these other stats, like how much weight were you allowed to carry before you became encumbered, right? I think 70 pounds. How much can you press? If you were literally doing a bench press, what's the max you could press, right? What are your odds of being able to open a door, right? And you're rolling a D20 and you want to roll this number or lower if you've got a 16, right? So as this number goes up, this number goes up. And this tells you, again, a lot about how they thought the game was played. They thought just the ability to open a door was important enough that it needed a stat in your strength, because you were going to be exploring dungeons. And in dungeons, doors can be stuck because it's a wooden door that's been underground forever and it is swollen with moisture, or it can be an iron door that has been locked and you're going to try and bust it open. And so just opening doors was a big deal, and so was bending bars and lifting gates. To me, these always seemed awfully related to each other. Why not just have one stat for both of these? And notice that this is on a D20 roll and this is a percentile check. And this encapsulates everything you need to know about how weird D&D was, is that there are two different stats for basically the same thing, right? Your ability to budge a heavy object that is a porthole of some sort, right? A door and a gate basically the same thing. And this is a D20 roll and this is a percentile roll, because God forbid you use the same logic. Let's just roll D20s for this stuff on 2 different rolls. And then notice that we compare that to our dexterity, and a dexterity of 16 does not get, it gets us completely different values than a strength of 16. We get +1 to our reaction adjustment, which is how likely we are to be surprised, which is even more confusing because elsewhere in the same character sheet, your charisma gives you a reaction adjustment, which is other people's reaction to you. Like your demeanor and personality. How does this NPC react to you? So that term reaction is used to mean 2 completely different things in the same character sheet. You get a missile attack adjustment, which means if you're firing like now we're used to, if you have a dexterity bonus, that helps you out if you're using a finesse weapon, if you're using a dagger or a rapier, or if you're using any ranged weapon. But here, it was only for ranged weapons. And then there was some kind of, we always had arguments about whether it was thrown weapons. Are they included? No, they should be strength, surely, right? That was a big argument that I never remember ever being resolved. But there's probably a rule for it somewhere that I've just forgotten. And then there's your defense adjustment, which is kind of what we imagine dex is for, right? The higher your dexterity, the better your armor class. And it's not just, the reason they didn't call it your AC adjustment is because it's not just your armor class, it's also any saving throws you might make against stuff you can dodge. And in my memory, that was not explicitly laid out. Like, it was up to the dungeon master to decide, well, this is a spell, but it's kind of like from a wand. So isn't it like a line? Isn't the spell effect like a line? Can't you dodge a ray? So there was always some interpretation there. And notice that you get +1 to your missile attacks, but -2 to your defensive adjustment. So there was no consistency in these numbers, even within a single stat. Strength +0 to hit, +1 to damage. Dex of the same number, +1 to your ranged attacks, but -2 to your armor class. And of course, remember that armor class goes down. Lower is better in 1st and 2nd edition. And this is one of the things that 3rd edition would clean up, thank God, because this never made any sense. It was always weird. It was neat to see all of these little pieces of data on your sheet, because especially when you're new to the game, you imagine you're going to do all this stuff. And so seeing all these different numbers, it just fills your mind with possibilities. And so that has some small degree of value. But in reality, it was just confusing. We were incredibly relieved when 3rd edition came out and resolved all of this nonsense and stats became uniform, and it will never go back to this. We will always be living in a post-3rd edition world where the game will always be systemically designed and robust, and we're never going to have a situation where the same number in 2 different stats gives you incredibly different numbers and abilities, and we have all of this weird stuff where we're using 2 different rolls to resolve basically the same thing. Skills and powers gave us a ton more options, and they were pretty cool. And my friends and I used a lot of these, but not all of them, because again, they were optional. And there were lots of really interesting character creation options in here that we liked. There was an incredibly robust revision to your weapon proficiencies and how you did attacks and damage. And again, this is another one of you got more attacks and you could do more damage if you were a fighter, for instance. And some of this was in the complete fighter's handbook. And this was all just another attempt to keep fighters relevant and fight that linear fighters and quadratic wizards problem that I think Monty Cook originally named. The idea that wizards eventually become unbelievably powerful and can alter time and reality, whereas fighters just get to swing their sword better. So every patch to D&D for 20 years, they would constantly be giving the fighter more ways to swing their weapon and more attacks and more damage and stuff like that. There was an edition of the game that fixed all this, but people didn't like it, so they threw it out. But this isn't the 4th edition video. This is the 3rd edition video. And it's not even the skills and powers video. If there's a great hue and cry, we might do a video just going over, because there were several of these books. And, my friends and I liked them. And we used them, but like I said, we didn't use all the rules. I very much doubt, when you see all of the different options that you got from this entire series of books, I very much doubt any table used all of these abilities. And this is we're coming toward the end of the life of TSR as the producers of Dungeons and Dragons, because this was the 90s. And while my friends and I liked the Skills and Powers series, the fact that they were releasing supplements that really no table really even could use all of, because they were so complex, so many different new options, tells you a lot about the state of Dungeons and Dragons at that time. Almost every product was fracturing the user base. They came out with, I don't know, something like 8 different settings in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, and every table was using a different D&D setting. They don't do that anymore. Now we basically assume that you're in the Forgotten Realms, and if you want to run something else, something homebrew, that's fine. That's on you. And as a result, every table was running a different version of D&D. It was deeply disunified. And the 90s were an interesting time for D&D just in general and tabletop RPGs, because we were seeing a revolution that really I don't think people talk about these days. The revolution in tabletop in the 90s was the advent of desktop publishing. This was the era of the desktop publishing suite of software that let normal people like me in my 20s design and publish relatively professional looking products. And as a result, there was an explosion of really good looking RPGs in the 90s that essentially dethroned Dungeons and Dragons. And obviously, if you were a game company and you had access to this desktop publishing software, you could make really remarkable looking games that changed what everybody thought about tabletop RPGs. And kind of the poster child for this is this game, Vampire the Masquerade, which I'd played. And this was a book that kind of ushered in the 90s, although it wasn't the first book to have really beautiful looking interiors. These days, if you went back and perused this original edition of the game, it would look pretty primitive. But at the time, it looked amazing to us because we were used to books that basically had, you know, courier typeface in the interior, and that was it, and hardly any interior art. But Vampire the Masquerade looked great on the inside, had a lot of art, and it did, in many ways, it did change tabletop gaming. But there were games that looked good before this that people have kind of forgotten about. Like the first Shadowrun book, which came out 2 years earlier, had a couple of full color interior plates, as I recall, and amazing interior art for the time, and also went a long way toward kind of selling the world. They had, in at least one of their books, I remember, they would have like posters, full color posters, photographs of posters for like bars in the world of Shadowrun. That was amazing. We had never seen anything like that. And Vampire the Masquerade comes along and it introduces an entirely new demographic to tabletop RPGs, all of the sort of goth kids at school. And that's a limiting term. There were a lot of kids in the 90s, a lot of college kids who would never have played a tabletop RPG, but they would never play Dungeons and Dragons or anything else around that time that looked like a tabletop RPG. But the fantasy of Vampire the Masquerade, which was set in the real modern world, you know, the kind of Anne Rice inspired modern world, but there's secretly vampires around. And there's a lot more of a kind of romantic attachment to the idea of being a vampire. You're playing a vampire. The vampire is not a villain. He's the player character, all kind of factored into this zeitgeist in the 90s that RPGs weren't about just kicking down doors and killing monsters anymore. Now, a lot of that is kind of revisionist. If you can get your hands on the original Vampire the Masquerade first edition book, they did not know that they were tapping into a new market. And so they did not cater to that market. And there are, you know, quotes from Foreigner songs and stuff like that, instead of it being all Bauhaus and Peter Murphy and David Bowie quotes. So, you know, they still thought they were making a game for the typical tabletop RPG player. But once they realized they had tapped into a new market, they revised it and they replaced it. They replaced the quotes with stuff that was appropriate to for a goth audience. And it took off. It exploded. I don't know the sales numbers, but I would accept that it did better than D&D, and it dominated. It dominated the culture. I don't know about sales, but it definitely dominated the culture. If you went to Gen Con in the 90s, no one cared about Dungeons and Dragons. It seemed like nobody was playing it anymore. The idea of playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I became a professional. In 1995, I got my first full-time job in tabletop gaming at a little company called Last Unicorn Games, and other professionals I knew, they really looked down on people that played D&D, including, not, you know, to a very tiny extent, me. If they knew I played D&D, they would be surprised and maybe a little disappointed that I still played that kids game that was just a really primitive game about kicking down doors and killing monsters. Whereas we want to be now storytellers. Vampire the Masquerade doesn't have a dungeon master or a game master or a referee or a judge. you're a storyteller. And that was the idea. The idea was fighting and killing monsters is passé. It's childish. We don't do that anymore. We tell stories. But if you play this game, it's mostly about fighting other bad guys, right? It's still a very, very combat-oriented game, but it had a really cool setting and a world that people engaged with intensely. Probably more, I would say, like, easily they were engaging with the Vampire the Masquerade world and fantasy more than anyone at the time was engaging with the D&D fantasy. It's a lot more relatable, takes place in the real world. So if you go to Gen Con in the 90s, games like Vampire the Masquerade dominated. It looked amazing thanks to desktop publishing, and there were tons, dozens, every year, dozens. So throughout the 90s, we're talking about hundreds of independently published tabletop RPGs that are now lost to history. My boss used to collect them. And so we had a whole wall at our company that was just bookcases full of these independently produced RPGs. And we take them off the shelf and read them. And they called them usually like heartbreakers, right? Because these are people who would mortgage their house if they had a house in order to print 10,000 copies in a huge fit of optimism, and then go rent a booth at Gen Con and try to sell them. And there was no way for them to stand out or differentiate themselves. And so all these folks ended up with just tons of books in their garage, and they got their hearts broken. But it definitely felt like a different, more experimental, more interesting time for the hobby. And of course, in the 90s, me as a professional, seemed like it was going to be like this forever, right? Everyone looked at D&D as kind of the progenitor of the hobby, and we had all moved on, and no one imagined that we were ever going to go back. So it's especially interesting to be sitting here in 2020 where, Dungeons and Dragons is more popular than ever. The idea that tabletop RPG and Dungeons and Dragons are synonymous, which I think is true for most people. You watch Stranger Things and you just assume that tabletop RPGs and D&D are the same thing. And at the time, even though it seemed like more people were playing more and different RPGs than ever, D&D was suffering quite badly. And I don't think that was because the game wasn't still popular. Lots of people were still playing D&D, but TSR just made a ton of really bad decisions, including releasing books like this. This is the first volume of the Encyclopedia Magica. It is literally just a collection in 4 volumes. This is the first of every magic item they had ever published in any product at TSR. And these were pretty popular. Most of my friends, if they were dungeon masters or if they were, serious hobbyists, they would buy these books, and they were well produced. They were a little smaller form factor than the normal 8.5 by 11 book. So they felt more like, like little workbooks, and they had a bookmark in them, which was really nice. And the covers were embossed and had an imprint, right? So those little ridges are actually physical ridges in the cover of the book. So they seemed really cool, and we all really liked them. And every one of these they sold, TSR lost money, because they were not doing good due diligence in their business. And the folks designing it and printing it weren't talking to the people in accounting. And my understanding is that that's not an exaggeration. Literally every time they sold one of these, TSR lost money. So they were facing a couple of problems. One, there was an entirely new wave of games that were leaving Dungeons and Dragons behind and making it irrelevant. So D&D had to respond to that. And the way they responded was with new campaign settings. And they tried a couple of other different games like Alternity, which was a science fiction game, but there was no real concerted effort, as I recall, on the part of TSR to capitalize on this new movement that was focusing more on narrative and the world and the fantasy and less on kicking down doors and killing orcs. And that's how we got, since they weren't going to make a new game, they were going to make supplements for their existing game. And that's how we got stuff like Planescape, which was pretty popular, and it looked completely unique. Like what I see when I look at this is 100% 90s desktop publishing design, down to the font, and the art in Planescape was amazing. It was a unique fantasy. It was more about the world. It was more about storytelling. But of course, the problem was it was still just some tiny fraction of the D&D world was going to buy a box set like this Planescape campaign setting. And they also had, they were continuing to make other worlds like Birthright, which was my favorite TSR setting, and Spelljammer, and just all sorts of crazy different campaign settings. So their response to this upswell of independent RPGs, storytelling RPGs, desktop publishing was just to fragment the user base of Dungeons and Dragons more and more with more different worlds, and sell these products to the core users that lost them money. And that brings us to 3rd edition. This is the 3rd edition cover. This is a photograph of the book, which is interesting because that means it is a photograph of a photograph. They actually physically made, for the 3rd edition rulebooks, these, I got to see them at Gen Con, these objects, these sculptures with gemstones, little plastic gemstones in them and stuff, and then took a picture of it like it was a real physical book, which was really neat, and I thought was very cool, incredibly well produced. 3rd edition changed everything. I said this before, we live in a post-3rd edition world, and to me it remains the most important edition of D&D. I can't prove that, I don't know what the unit of measurement for importance is. If there were a unit of measurement for self-importance, it would probably be the Colville. But yeah, it changed everything because it was the first systemic version of the game. And it exists as a direct result of products like Planescape, although, Planescape wasn't a great offender in this regard. It's a symbol of all of these different settings that they produced, each one of which would sell to a smaller and smaller audience, because if you liked one setting, why would you buy another when you already have the world you like? So the D&D audience was becoming more fragmented. Products like this would be selling to smaller and smaller fragments of that audience. And products like the Encyclopedia Magica, which were really well produced, very expensive books to make, and they didn't price them high enough, and as a result they were literally losing money. And so as a result, in the 90s, Wizards of the Coast, off the back of Magic the Gathering, and I think people now forget this, but also they had the Pokemon card game, and that has always been the number one moneymaker in the Pokemon world. That card game makes way more money than the video games do. Between Pokemon and Magic the Gathering, Wizards of the Coast had become a titan in gaming. They were making so much money that they were able to swoop in and buy TSR. And when they did that in the late 90s, they immediately started work on a new version of D&D. They were going to make their own version of Dungeons and Dragons, and it was going to reflect not only all of the design that we had seen in the 90s, there's tons of interesting bits and pieces of 3rd edition that we'll get into that to me are obviously borrowed from other games from the 90s. So it synthesized a lot of that design, but it also systematized everything for the first time ever in D&D. It would be a real system from the ground up, all these parts designed to work together so that if you were trying to figure out how something worked and you didn't know, you could guess without having to look it up. And because you understood the system, your guess would probably be correct. And if you went and looked it up, you'd be like, oh, yep, it works the way I thought it did. That was certainly not true in any edition of D&D after that. And the changes they made to the game in, the year 2000, we are still living with. So I start playing D&D in 1985 or 86 with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. 2nd edition is the first edition that comes out while I am playing, and my friends and I played through its entire life cycle from when it came out to when it was canceled. 3rd edition represents the first edition of the game that came out while I was a professional in the tabletop industry. And in fact, I was working at Wizards of the Coast when this product debuted in Gen Con 2000. Wizards of the Coast bought the company that I worked for, Last Unicorn Games, lock, stock, and barrel. And we stayed in our satellite office, so I don't really have a lot of inside dirt on it, but I did learn a lot about what was going on up there in Seattle while they were working on this. And it's too bad because my memory is faulty, and a lot of the stuff I remember was in blog posts on fan sites in the late 1990s leading up to the release of this book at Gen Con 2000. And I did a lot of research using the Wayback Machine, trying to find some of that stuff, and I can't. So it's too bad because there were a lot of really interesting stories about the design decisions they made when they created this book. So for instance, I remember them going to Peter Adkison, the owner of Wizards of the Coast because they were to settle a design debate. And the issue was, should monsters use the same rules as heroes, or should they have their own rules? And up until 3rd edition, monsters basically had their own attributes and logic. And you would not expect to see monsters with any of the class abilities or class options that heroes had. And Peter Atkinson said, monsters should use the same rules as characters. I want to know when a monster does something cool, that if I had made different decisions with my character, I might have gotten access to that feat or special ability. And that had a huge impact on the design of 3rd edition. So for instance, to give you an idea of how impactful what at the time might have been a seemingly minor decision to say, listen, the monsters are going to use the same rules as the players. Let's check out the Monster Manual. This is the 3rd edition Monster Manual. And it was a huge decision, just something small like that. If we check out like, a demon, let's say, let's find a relatively high level demon like Nalfenshi or Nalfeshni. This is a nasty monster that you're going to kill. It's got a life expectancy of maybe at the most 7 rounds, but you check out like how many skills it has. It's got bluff for some reason, plus 22 ranks in bluff. It's got diplomacy. It's got disguise. Why does it have disguise? What is it going to, this kind of stuff is so silly in retrospect. At the time you would imagine, oh, I might play this demon in a scenario where he's disguised himself as something. But as far as I know, this guy doesn't have any like ability to change form necessarily. That's not why he has disguise. He doesn't have disguise because this type of demon is all about turning into a human and passing himself off as someone else. He has disguise for the same reason he has bluff and diplomacy, because he's using the same rules for skills. He's got a huge number of skill points because he's such a high level character, and he's got to spend that skill points on something. And there are limits to how you spend your skill points. So after a while, you're like, well, he's got all the stuff that a demon would need. What else are we going to give him? Let's give him some bluff, I guess. Let's give him diplomacy and disguise. And it became very difficult for any dungeon master to make use of all of these options. For instance, let's just check out this Horned Devil. This is a CR 16 creature. 3rd edition is the birth of challenge rating, by the way, which is, I think, basically still applied the way it's always been. It's a varying utility depending on how you run the game. But just in spell-like abilities, right? Just this one tiny little section here, this dude has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different spells to choose from, each of which has a different DC, a different number of times per day it can be used, all in one tiny little stat block. And then there's just an enormous number of other abilities. And I think that at the time when this book came out, we were all in love with how robust it was, with how much sense it made. All this stuff seemed perfectly reasonable and logical because it was built on a well-designed foundation. But as we ran this game, as we ran 3rd edition, over years, we started to just suffer under the burden of all of these rules and this complexity. And you start looking at monsters like this and you're like, I don't understand. How am I ever going to use all of these abilities when this thing has, it's not even how am I going to use all of them. You couldn't hold them all in your head at once. It was simply too many options for one monster that might just be one tiny part of a larger encounter, and certainly one tiny part of a larger adventure. So there was this huge burden of, I would say, like over design that at the time, though, when this book came out, it made total sense to us. So Wizards of the Coast buys TSR in 1997 off the back of the success of Magic the Gathering, and they spent the next 2.5 years developing this edition of the game. It releases at Gen Con in 2000. I was there at the time. I was an employee of Wizards of the Coast, and they had a whole ad campaign called Back to the Dungeon that was a huge push. They spent more money advertising this than, I think it's safe to say, anyone ever spent advertising any tabletop RPG. And the whole thrust of this ad campaign, including ads in like Maxim magazine, like not gaming magazines, mass market products. I don't know if you remember Maxim, or magazines, but they spent a lot of money, and the whole thrust of the ad was back to the dungeon. They wanted to get D&D back to its roots, making fantasy heroes that knock down doors and kill monsters. And they believed, thanks, I think, largely to Peter Adkison, but he was not the only one. Peter Adkison, there's only one N in there. He believed that he had a long-running D&D campaign, and he believed people still wanted to knock down doors and kill monsters. And he was proved largely correct. This was very unpopular at the time. If you were a developer, especially, a lot of people in the 90s thought that like I said, that D&D was, if anything, it was a product for kids. Adults played storytelling games, and people just didn't believe that D&D would ever be able to reclaim its crown as the king of the tabletop RPG hobby. But not only did it reclaim the crown, D&D 3 was more successful, I think, than any version of D&D before, than any tabletop RPG had ever been. Maybe up to only 5th edition, I think, was finally dethroned it. And that was a very interesting time to be a professional in the hobby, watching other people really struggle with the idea that D&D could ever be popular again, because to them it represented such a backward-looking way of approaching tabletop RPGs that they felt should be more character, drama, narrative focused, and maybe even have dice. You'd never fight a monster in some of these games. Most of these games didn't have monster manuals. So that was super interesting for me as an inveterate fan of D&D to have my convictions that this was a lasting hobby and that D&D was still a lot of fun largely proved correct. They made an unbelievable number of decisions regarding the production of this product, not just in stuff like, monsters should use the same rules as characters, but also this was the edition where they introduced the OGL for the first time. The open gaming license, the idea that the rules would be available to anyone publicly in a free license that lasted in perpetuity. It still exists. If you wanted to make a supplement for this edition of the game, you could legally. And you would be able to call it you'd be able to use really with a license, because you can't copyright gameplay mechanics. But what you can do is you can copyright the D20 logo. So if you wanted to say this is an official D20 product, you could use Wizards of the Coast's logo on your product. That's really what the license got you. Anyone can make a game where you roll a D20 and higher is better. That's not owned by anybody, but Wizards of the Coast owned this one specific branded trademark right here, the D20 system. This is a book that I wrote. This is a 3rd edition, third-party supplement for a company called Eden Studios, and I wrote a couple of books for them, or designed a couple of books for them. And there's a whole, an unbelievable, innumerable number of third-party products that came out as a result. Whole companies came out of the OGL. The idea of the OGL was primarily that making adventures for D&D is kind of a losing game for Wizards of the Coast. Because if you make a product that the players want, everyone at the table is going to buy it, right? If your table has 6 people, a DM and 5 players, all of them are going to buy the player stuff, but only the dungeon master buys an adventure, and not all dungeon masters are going to buy that adventure. So it's a lot of work. Adventures take a lot of work to produce and play test and art and all that stuff. Why not open the system so anyone who wants to can make adventures for us? This came out of, this is Ryan Dancy's brainchild. Ryan Dancy was working for a company called Five Rings Publishing, and he's the dude that brokered the deal between TSR and Wizards of the Coast. So the kind of his reward was he became the brand manager full-time at Wizards of the Coast for Dungeons and Dragons. And he was a huge advocate for the open gaming license because he watched the open license movement happen in software. Somebody once told him that only like 10% of all software written professionally is for commercial use, ends up in a product that someone buys. The majority of code written for software is internal products that are never made for sale in any market. They're just a software that helps a company run itself better. And at that point, if you're not making this as a product to sell, why not open it so other companies can use it and improve it, and you can use their improvements? Your software will get better because other people have access to the code and improve it. And that is that system works. And there's lots of amazing software is written on the back of the open license. And Ryan said, why don't we do that in gaming? And he was a visionary in that respect, and it worked. Also, privately, Ryan had said that he just didn't like the idea of one company owning Dungeons and Dragons, that Dungeons and Dragons was a hobby. It was more than just this one product, and that anybody should be able to create for it. And so he sold the idea to the executives at Wizards of the Coast on the idea that other companies are going to make products for us. And they did. It was impossible for any one person, even any one game store, to stock every single third edition product, official and third party. There was just too much of it. Like I said, entire companies came out of the OGL. And some of those companies did well, but I question whether or not there was any real demand for third-party content, because Wizards of the Coast was producing like a product a month, and they were able to afford, because they had all the money, the best designers, and they could afford the best artists, and their products had better paper and better covers, and they were just better produced. So there was just an unending supply of official D&D third edition stuff. So at the time, the OGL was so exciting. Having all these different companies making all these products was so exciting. And retailers just assumed, based on how popular third edition was, it was hugely popular, that these third-party products would sell, so they stocked them. But if you can find a game store that's still around from the year 2000, a lot of them still have some of these products in stock, which is crazy to me. They just bought so many of them, and there just wasn't that much demand, because Wizards of the Coast could make stuff like the Draconomicon. This is an official Wizards of the Coast product that they produced, just a book about dragons, how to run them for dungeon masters. I think there were rules for player character, dragons, and Dragonborn. Their kind of early version of Dragonborn are in here. There was an amazing amount of really useful stuff in this book, including layers, not just layers, but like treasure hoards, custom unique treasure hoards for all these different types of dragons at every level. Like if you fight a dragon at first level, here is its treasure hoard. And it's different than all the other treasure hoards in the book. And the art for this book was gorgeous. The production was super, super high quality. So when you look at books like the Draconomicon, and they were producing a book like this every month, and the fact that they didn't stop making adventures, they sold the executives on the OGL saying third-party companies will make adventures so we don't have to. But it was their system, and they understood it better than anybody else. They had the organized play system, which I personally think any tabletop RPG needs to have organized play in order to be successful, where volunteers will run your game product for players that show up at local game stores, and in exchange they get early access to exclusive product. They had, that kind of data coming in, so they knew how people were playing the game better than anybody else, and they were able to make better adventures than other folks, by and large. Certainly better produced adventures with better art. And so they kept making adventures, and they kept making they kept making products like this. So there wasn't really any demand for the third-party stuff, but at the time we did not know that. At the time there was so much of it, and the edition was so popular that we just assumed that there must be demand for this. And a book like the Liber Mysterious, it sold well enough. I remember getting royalty payments for this, and it was quite a lot of money. But compared to the stuff Wizards of the Coast was doing, it was the demand, I think, was illusory. But we didn't know that at the time. It was a bold new future, and it ushered in a new age of tabletop gaming, which we're still living with today. People still associate D&D and tabletop RPGs as basically the same thing. I think a lot of people play or are aware of D&D and just don't know that there are other games. And that core fantasy of being a fantasy hero who goes into dungeons and kills monsters in order to get treasure and get experience and level up, rinse and repeat, is still the dominant way to play. And in the 90s, that seemed so archaic and so far behind us that it's kind of astonishing to me that it turns out the 90s are just a fad. So let's take a look at the book. What would you have got if you went to Gen Con in the year 2000 and you went to the Wizards of the Coast booth and you bought one of these books? You would have got a incredibly dense tome. For one thing, these are the credits. Monty, Jonathan Tweet, Skip Williams, all of whom would go on after this to do remarkable things, and all of whom were inveterate. I remember Jonathan Tweet, who had designed a game called Everway. Having him on board, really, like, this combination of the guy that designed Everway plus Monty, who had done a lot of the Planescape stuff, I think, and Skip Williams, who had been the guy writing the Sage Advice for second edition D&D, was a really interesting combination of developers, and they produced what I thought of as a remarkable game. I still think it's remarkable. So this is the book, and you automatically, one of the first things you notice is just how dense the text is. You can't really see it here because they use periods to keep the eye following, so you can see the feats are on page 79. But if you jump in here, look closely. Do you see how there's this lined rule underneath? It's an illustration of lines going across the text underneath it that are faded, right? And they're there for every single line. And the reason they did, I think the reason they did this was this book has an insane number of words per page. I think it might be like 1,250 or 1,300 words per page, which is almost double the normal number of words per page of a normal book in this category. And I think that's largely still true. And the reason they did that was because they were trying to save money. They didn't want to make a 500 page rule book. They wanted this to be, relatively cheap to produce. So how do you do that? Well, if you're going to reduce the page count, but you're not going to cut text, then the text needs to be really tiny. And if there isn't this rule in the background, these little brown lines everywhere, then your eyes would just start bleeding. You wouldn't be able to follow the text from one line to another. And one of the things I love, I think you can learn so much about each edition of the game just looking at the first couple of pages and what they thought was important. What's the first thing you do? There's no forward saying, hey, here was our thinking about this edition of the game. There's no what is a role-playing game as the first piece of content. Nope. The first piece of content, this tells you almost everything you need to know about their attitude. The first piece of content, page 4, there's literally nothing before this except the credits and the index. Make a character. Here's a sample character sheet. Here's an illustration of a character sheet. And here's what you do. Step 1, ask your DM what house rules they're using. Step 2, make ability scores. And you notice there's one method right here. You roll 4 6-sided dice, you ignore the lowest die, and then you're going to place them where you want. You're not going to do it in order. And for the first time, there is an official mulligan rule. There was advice in every edition of the game before this, including advice from Gary, hidden away, I think, in the DM's guide for AD&D, saying, listen, if your character doesn't have at least 2 15s, then you're not a hero. You're going to have a bad life. The player's not going to enjoy playing that character, so let the player re-roll. Well, here, you can explicitly roll again if your total modifiers, which makes sense to us now, but at the time, we were like, well, what modifiers? Which modifiers? If your total modifiers are less than 0 or less, you can re-roll, right? So you have a +4 from an 18 in one stat, but if you have a bunch of other stats that are giving you -2 and -3, you're going to re-roll. Or even if all of your bonuses, if you got +2 here and a -2 there and a +1 there and it totals out to like +1 or whatever, if you don't have a score above 13, go ahead and re-roll, right? Because that's not a heroic character. So this is the beginning of having an official mulligan. Notice that there may be other ways like point buy in these rules, but the default explanation for building a character doesn't even reference that. So I think that stuff is fascinating. And then we have feats and we have skills for the first time. We'll talk about those. They're skills now. They're not non-weapon proficiency. So for the first time, D&D becomes sort of a skill-based system, or not really skill-based. It's still combat-based, but it's got a robust skill system for the first time. I still find it fascinating that in the D&D world, everyone's divided in every kind of profession you could have. It breaks down to, I make weapons, or I use weapons, so I have weapon proficiencies. Or if I don't do that, then I don't make weapons, right? What do you do? Well, I use a sword. Okay, what do you do? I don't use a sword. I have non-weapon proficiencies. Being a farmer, agriculture was a non-weapon proficiency because they could not bear, for some reason, they could not bear to call them skills. But here, 3rd edition says, nope, they're skills and you got a lot of them. And they're interestingly designed, but they're also kind of weirdly designed. Spoilers. So once you're done making a character, what's next? Well, here's the introduction, but notice that the entire introduction is like, I don't know, it's a paragraph in a bullet point list. That's it. After that, it's what do you need to play? This is the player's handbook. Here's how it's broken up. Here's how the dice work. Here's how the language of dice work. And I find reading these introductions is fascinating. And I think this one is really, really good. I love the fact that they cut out the what is a role-playing game. I think that stuff is ridiculous. And it's just an opportunity for each designer in the 80s and 90s wanted to be the one that said, it's like playing, cops and robbers, except there's dice now. I always thought that stuff stuff was ridiculous. If they're holding this book in their hand, they probably know what a role-playing game is. You know, you don't pick up a video game and they start by saying, what is a video game? They might start with, here's how to use the controller. But even these days, we know that the stick is for moving and you press the button to fire, you pull the trigger to fire. So they get over that stuff. So let's read this introduction. Welcome to the game that has defined the fantastic imagination for a quarter of a century. Well, that's marketing wank and hyperbole, but it's not without a lot of truth. When you play the D&D game, you create a unique fictional character. True. So this kind of is what is role-playing, right? But notice that this is pretty straightforward. You create a unique fictional character that lives in your imagination and the imagination of your friends. One person in the game, the Dungeon Master, controls the monsters and the people that live in the fantasy world. This makes it seem very straightforward. It doesn't make being a dungeon master seem hugely over the top, like you have to build an entire world. And a lot of the earlier language in earlier editions was all about how much work there was for the DM. And they made it, they were pitching you the DM's job in a very kind of aggrandizing way. You know, you control an entire universe, but they were trying to make it sound cool and fun, but in fact, it sounded super intimidating. This makes it sound much less intimidating. Oh, I'm the DM. I control the monsters. Oh, and the people that live in the fantasy world. Great. Me and my friends are going to face dangers and explore the mysteries that the Dungeon Master sets before us. It doesn't even say that of the world. It doesn't mention building a world. Building a world is intimidating. It just says you're going to run some monsters and you're going to run some other characters and you're going to create encounters and the players are going to play through them. And then it says each character's imaginary life is different. Your character might explore ancient ruins guarded by devious traps. This is sort of the thesis statement for a third edition. Like if they were only going to pick one thing, it would be the first thing on this list. Put loathsome monsters to the sword. I like that. It's dramatic, right? It's not explicitly referencing game mechanics. It's this poetic way of describing what we're going to do. I'm going to put loathsome monsters to the sword. Loot the tomb of a long forgotten wizard. Cast mighty spells and burn and blast your foes. Solve diabolic mysteries. Find magic items, rings, and other items. So some of these are abstract, solving diabolic mysteries, but some of these are really straightforward. I want loot. I want to find magic items and rings and other weapons. Make peace between warring tribes. Look, suddenly diplomacy and politics and storytelling come into it because all of this is possible in D&D. Those of us who came up in the 90s and saw all of these people playing these storytelling games and turning their nose down at D&D, we're like, my campaign has all that stuff. My campaign has romance and politics and all sorts of complex storytelling in it. It just also has dungeons and monsters. Bring the dead back. No, I like this. Get brought back from the dead. So they're telling you out of the gate, your character could die. Don't worry too much. You'll get brought back. That's a very interesting formulation. Face undead creatures that can drain life with a single touch. Sneak into a castle. What great verbs. Remember we did a whole video on verbs. These verbs are awesome, right? We're going to explore. We're going to solve. We're going to sneak. We're going to travel to other planes of existence, right? Maybe travel doesn't sound exciting, but the rest of that sentence sounds exciting. We're going to wrestle a carnivorous ape, right? That sounds very kind of Star Trek, right? Very original series Star Trek. Probably an albino ape with a poisonous horn, I'm guessing. Forge a magic wand. Wait, I can make magic items? Yep, that is core to these rules. I can get turned to stone. I might get turned into a toad, presumably a slimy toad. Turn someone else into a toad. I love that. I could get turned into a toad or I can turn someone else. If you've never really gotten into the game, maybe you know your friends are playing it, reading this list is going to excite you. And the thing about it is nothing on this list is weird or out of the ordinary for D&D. This is not an abstract list of things that you might do but probably won't. No, actually, you're probably going to do all these things if you play every week for just like a year. Become a king or queen. Matt Colville gives you the thumbs up for that, right? Strongholds, followers, kingdoms, and warfare. My entire career right now is just this one line. Discover unique and powerful artifacts of amazing magical power. So out of the gate, they are telling us what the game's about, and it's a very broad array of different things you can do. It includes role-playing and politics, but it includes stuff like crafting, making magic items. It includes not just fighting monsters, but the crazy things that can happen when you fight monsters, like getting turned into a toad or getting turned to stone. So I love this stuff. I think it's great. And the art in this book, there's a lot of it, and it's not the kind of gorgeous full color. There's some gorgeous full color stuff in here, but there's also a lot of like pencil sketches, and I think they did a pretty good job combining all sorts of different, and I think this was an intentional decision. It might have been cost savings, right? To not have this piece we're looking at be full color. It's just a grayscale line art, but also they didn't want to throw out that aesthetic that D&D had for a long time of black and white line art. They wanted some of that in here, so you get a mixture of all sorts of stuff. Now here, for the first time, we're going to end up with interesting ability scores. Notice that there's one table for ability scores, right? My dex, my strength, my intelligence all use these modifiers, right? If I've got a 16, it doesn't matter where I put it, it's going to be +3. This might be actually kind of tiny considering this is a 4K video. If I've got a 16, I get a +3, and it doesn't matter where I put it. And I think that's fascinating, and really the only kind of thing that's broad enough apart from your modifier that they included in the core rules, the core table here, is spell casting. Obviously not all characters cast spells, but enough do that they felt like all spell progression is going to work the same. And this was a big deal, and we'll talk about why in a second. So you got, here's what a strength score means, right? Here's what skills go with it. Dexterity shows you like how dexterous am I, but we're just trying to understand it, right? These things aren't, this isn't like bend bars and lift gates where each of these charts is somehow game mechanical and relevant. They're just trying to give you examples of how strong is somebody that's got a 30 strength. So they kept all of the original stats, but they came up with this new system, which I think is basically from like Ars Magica or Fudge. I don't remember which one. The idea that you're going to roll a bunch of dice, and those dice are going to translate into a score, and that score is basically going to be between 3 and 18. And then you're going to look up that score on a table, right? That score ends up being the input to a chart, and the output is the number you actually care about, which is your modifier. And overwhelmingly in this game, you use your modifier. Spells that increase your strength increase the score, but then you have to translate what that means in terms of the modifier. And they easily could have, they still could, I sort of don't know why they don't, they could have just thrown out the idea of the score and go directly to the modifier, but they wanted to keep that 3 to 18 legacy. They wanted that legacy of an 18 strength being the best you can naturally get on the dice, right? And they still want to keep that idea, and we still have it. We're still stuck with the idea that you're the very confusing idea to a new player that you're going to roll dice, step 1, step 2, generate a number from them, add it up, drop one of them, which you don't normally do in any dice game ever. Do you roll dice and then drop one? So that's a weird thing you have to teach players. And then you generate a number, and it turns out that number doesn't do anything. It's just the lookup, and that the values go from +1 to they go from +4 to -4. That's the normal range. So your zero's in the middle, and you either go +1 +2 or -1 -2. That is not something D&D invented. That's from at least Ars Magica or Fudge. I quite liked Ars Magica. We'll probably talk about it in a video someday. But that uniform application of modifiers was a huge relief to all of us. It made the game so much easier to understand compared to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Of course, you still make a character the same way that you always do, where you choose a race and a class and combine them together. These days, we would say ancestry, I think. But that hasn't changed. That probably never will change. Here's an illustration of all the different races you can play in the player's handbook. And I like this stuff, so you see how tall people are. Of course, I think it's D&D that goes with shorter elves, rather. I think that Tolkien imagined elves to be tall and willowy compared to humans. I could be wrong about that. Maybe woodland elves, maybe the Legolas elf versus the Galadriel elf were of different heights. I think in my fantasy RPG, elves are going to be taller than humans probably, because that makes sense to me. But notice this illustration is not this gorgeous full color piece of art. It's a grayscale piece of, it's got nice, texturing on it and stuff like that, but it's not incredibly well rendered. And that was part of the art style here. Let's check out, what do humans, I like contrasting like humans and dwarves, for instance. What do humans get? Well, we get some fluff, flavor text, personality. Aren't we all already humans? Don't we know what a human personality is? Physical description, these are often interesting to read because it's almost like an alien is describing what human beings are like. But what do humans get in terms of special abilities? Well, they get an extra feat at first level. Feats are a new way, although I think we saw feat-like abilities in the player's options. Remember that from second edition. the player's option book had rules for customizing your character, but it was all point-based. It was very interesting and all point-based, where you had traits, and if you saw the list of traits in here, some of them would be pretty familiar to you, I think. Let's see, where is the list of traits? These are your non-weapon proficiencies, right? I love the idea that just being a farmer is a non-weapon proficiency. But traits are another thing entirely, and you'll see there's alertness and ambidexterity, and there's all sorts of stuff in here that would turn into feats in 3rd edition and maybe even still beyond. And they work a lot, basically the same way feats work. But the thing about it was, in the Player's Option series, this is point-based. You would spend points to buy these, and you could get points by buying disadvantages. This is classic 90s design, or even I would say mid to late 80s design. The idea of perks and disadvantages, or perks and flaws. And you start with points, and if you want more points, you would buy disadvantages, things that made your character less optimal. And it would often be fun to role play, or fun for the dungeon master to create scenarios to exploit, and they would give your character more background and more personality, but they offset your traits. But here in 3rd edition, we just have feats. Feats are always good, although stay tuned. Feats are always good, and humans get an extra one, and that represents the idea that humans are more versatile. Humans have more access to different ways to be cool. The challenge of making humans interesting, I think the 3rd edition was the first edition that solved the problem of making humans interesting and fun to play, although I think they could have gone further in that regard. Remember that level limits, which were a real thing in AD&D, where an elf could only advance so far as a fighter before they hit a level cap. The idea that there were no 8th level fighters anywhere in the world in AD&D is a very weird idea, but that was Gary's kind of kludgy way to say, hey, the game is about human beings, because otherwise, he discovered, people just wouldn't play humans because it was more, they already play a human in real life. It was just more interesting to play an elf or a dwarf or a half orc. It always seemed weird to me that you could be a half orc, but not an orc. Why not just let people be orcs? It seems very strange to me. I think maybe that was predicated on their idea that orcs were still kind of like pre-civilized, almost pre-cultural monsters. But that was never my group's attitude. We always assumed that orcs were just kind of like just the chaotic things that live in the forest that weren't elves, the nasty ones that wanted to kill us because we've been making farmland out of their homeland. So humans get an extra feat, and we'll talk about feats. They also get extra skill points. So they are more skilled, which is also nice. We talk about languages, and then we get to favored class. So the D&D 3 introduces the idea of a favored class, where when you multi-class, you suffer an XP penalty, which is crazy. This is super interesting to me. Like, being multi-classed meant my XP was valued less, unless I picked a specific class. For instance, if I'm a dwarf, my favored class is fighter, right? So a dwarf priest who wanted to take levels of fighter didn't suffer any XP penalty, but a dwarf priest who wanted to take levels of thief would suffer an XP penalty. And that's an interesting idea, but these days we wouldn't do penalties and probably wouldn't do this favored class thing at all. We would just let anybody from any background, any ancestry be any class. But this is their way of saying dwarves tend to be fighters, right? Dwarves tend to be fighters. So multi-classing into fighter is always quote unquote free for a dwarf. And I think that's effective, but I think there are probably better ways to do that. So humans, their special ability is they can multi-class into anything and they don't have to suffer any penalties. So humans are more varied. They're just better at being a D&D character, which explains their prominence in the fiction, or at least it's designed to create their prominence in the fiction. And it worked to a certain extent. I think my friends and I certainly, when we wanted to play I think what it did was it meant that when we wanted to play a human, we felt better about it. I don't think it actually changed anyone's mind. Do I want to play a dwarf, or do I want to play an elf, or do I want to play a human? Because you started with your idea, I think, of your character or the class you wanted. I want to be an elf ranger or whatever. And then you work backward from that. So for us playing these cool abilities, which, this is the first time humans get, I would say, competitive abilities, it just made us feel better about something we were going to do anyway. What do dwarves get? Well, so humans only get a couple of things, but dwarves get all sorts of cool stuff. They get bonuses to their stats. They get +2 to Constitution, but it's got to be balanced. So you're going to get -2 to Charisma. And I think we're seeing the end of this kind of logic where different species get a bonus and a penalty to keep them balanced. And they get dark vision, which is pretty amazing. And these days, I think everybody but humans gets dark vision. They still get stone cunning, right? They're still native stonesmiths, and they tend to live underground. So they get a +2 bonus on any checks to notice unusual stonework, such as sliding walls or stone-based traps or new construction, right? So they would detect a Murphy orc trap, for instance. And that, again, tells you a lot about how they expected the game to be played. A lot of dungeon delving, and the makeup of the physical design of the dungeon is going to be important to the adventure, and a dwarf is going to know that. You also get a +2 bonus on saving throws against poison. They are naturally hardy and resistant to toxins. +2 racial bonus on saving throws against spells and spell-like effects. They're resistant to magic. They get a bonus to attack rolls against orcs and goblinoids. You are good at fighting giants. You get a +4 bonus. And notice it's a +4 dodge bonus. It's a +4 racial bonus. Every bonus has a meta tag, right? Dodge, racial, there's all sorts of different kinds of bonuses. And the idea was, and I think this is a really good design, but it's very noodly. The idea was bonuses of the same type, bonuses with the same meta tag, do not stack. And the corollary to that is, if they're different, they do stack. So half of playing this game was just adding up bonuses. As you played, the bard would give you bonuses to this and bonuses to that. The cleric would buff you. You'd have all these bonuses you were tracking. And the rule was, if there were bonuses from 2 different meta tags, they stacked. If they were the same tag, they didn't. And that was a pretty good rule. It was easy to follow. So you're good at fighting giants, +4 dodge bonus. And you are good at appraising well-crafted items. That's a skill. Appraise is one of the new skills. You get a +2 bonus on craft checks that are related to stone and metal. Crafting was a big part of this game. And that was it. You got a lot of interesting little noodly mechanical bonuses, not only to skills, but also to attacks and saving throws in your defenses, compared to the human that just gets extra feet, some skill points. That's it, basically. So I think humans were competitive mechanically, but they still weren't very interesting compared to all these other species. Here's the list of classes. It's basically the same list we have now. I think the only difference is now there's a warlock, but otherwise I believe it's basically the same. Barbarian is core, the bard is core. Remember, in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons back in the late 70s, being a bard, well, go look up, if hopefully it's in the video that I made, how to be a bard was super, super weird. You had to go become like a thief, and then stop being a thief and be a fighter, and stop being a fighter and be, was it a druid or something? Or a monk? And once you had accumulated a certain number of class levels in each of these, you qualified for being a bard, which to me was Gary's way of saying, I think bards were dumb. So, okay, if you want to be one, here's this incredibly ridiculous, silly way to become it. But now you can just be a bard out of the gate. Cleric, druid, fighter, monks are core now. I don't remember if they were core in 2nd edition. Paladin, the best class, ranger, rogue, sorcerer, and wizard. Now, I am of the opinion, and there may be evidence for this, but I don't know, that they included this, they invented the sorcerer, the same reason we still have it now, because the wizard was complex. The wizard was still Vancian magic. You would memorize spells and then forget them and have to rememorize them, and that didn't make any sense. And so people were fed up with that, and they just wanted to cast spells and blow people up. And that was the sorcerer. That was what the sorcerer was for. People that wanted to be a wizard, but they didn't want all the bookkeeping. And me, I would be like, look, man, just decide how magic is going to work. And if it's Vancian, then it's Vancian, and make people deal with it. But I don't know, maybe not. Maybe I would keep the sorcerer if it were up to me. Now, here's another way 3rd edition innovated, and it was really, I think, well designed, but I think we have kind of moved beyond it. Now we have what's called the Proficiency Bonus, which is, if you're familiar with 5th edition only and you know about the Proficiency Bonus, the Proficiency Bonus is like this 2.0. You have what was called your base attack bonus. The idea that as your character leveled up, you got better. You had basically this hidden skill. You had a skill that wasn't on the list of skills, and that skill was called attacking. And the idea was skills were a way to customize your character. You couldn't assume that every class had any one skill. It was up to the player. How did they spend their skill points? But there was one skill everyone had, and it was your attack bonus. And you could not spend points to improve it, because this bonus represents how good your character is at D&D. And if you could improve this by spending points, You would. So it's just this flat number that improves as you level up, and some characters are better at attacking than others. Fighters, barbarians, rangers, paladins are the best. Their attack bonus improves every level it goes up, and they get their second attack per round at 6th level. Clerics, druids, rogues, bards, monks are they advance a little more slowly, whereas wizards and sorcerers, they don't really worry about attack rolls. If the wizard is making an attack roll, something horrible has happened. They've run out of spells and they're desperate for survival. So the core mechanic of D&D, making attack rolls, fighting monsters, these classes are better. The paladin, the fighter, the ranger, the barbarian are better at this, and they advance every level, and they get their second attack faster, and they get a 4th attack at 20th, actually at 16th level. No one else ever gets a 4th attack per round. So this is very good design. I think we are better at this now, but this was the first time all of these classes were all fall under the same rubric, the same rules. We all have base attack bonus, and it progresses for everybody, and we all get multiple attacks. We just get all these things at different levels. Here's another major innovation. It's on the same page as the base attack bonus. It is the chart for experience. Let me blow it up a little bit to make it a little bit easier for you folks to see. Right, this is the chart that all characters used for advancing and leveling up. And even when I was a teenager and I saw that wizards got a D4 for hit points compared to fighters that got a D10. And wizards had their own unique experience point chart, as did all classes, and they leveled up slower. I was like, that's bad design. I was like 17. I was like, that's bad design. That's double dipping. Either make it so they have fewer hit points, or make it so that they level up slower. What's the point of doing both? They represent the same thing. The idea that wizards are fragile or they level up slowly. And so here for the first time, we are, there's a lot of information actually packed into this. All characters advance at the same rate. Now, if you multi-class, then you take a penalty. The idea being that somebody who just focuses on being a fighter is going to learn how to be a fighter faster than somebody who is splitting up their attention between multiple different skill sets, between like fighter and ranger or whatever. And so giving that fighter player 10,000 XP, they get farther as a fighter than the person who's got multiple classes. That's where that XP penalty comes from. But here we have max skill ranks. So you can't just decide to put all your points in one skill. You've got to spread it out a little bit. And something interesting happens because each class has a certain core skill proficiencies, and you could buy other skills even if it wasn't on your class list, but your points counted for half, which meant suddenly you were tracking half skill points, which I think is awful. I think anytime you've got a system where you're dealing with fractions of points, then you've mathed it wrong and you need to go back to the drawing board. But you often would have a half point in a skill. Also, I think for the first time, your ability scores would improve regularly as your character leveled up. You would get stronger as you played, even if you didn't have any magic items. So let's check out our fighter. Here's where we get our class lists for the first time. And of course, we still have different hit dice. This is never going to go away. Different classes are just hardier than others. And the idea is that, sorcerers and wizards are incredibly powerful, and so they're fragile. And, I think there was an edition of the game, I think, that tried to balance this out. But like I said, people didn't like it. Here's where we talk about class skills, the idea that some of the skills on the list are core to your class and some aren't. So your points count differently. If if you can also buy skills from other classes, but each skill point only buys half ranks, which, made sense at the time. No one complained about this at the time, made perfect sense. But as I developed as a designer and as we played this game, I started to look at half points and half ranks as being kind of silly. Let's see, what does the fighter get? I love this bard illustration, for instance. Also, even though this is a game for the 2000s, this is a very 1990s illustration in a way I'm not sure I could really describe. There's lots of information in here, obviously, but we're just making a fighter in every edition of the game. We'll roll our stats soon. We'll see what Duncan the 8th looks like in just a minute. So here's our questing knight, our conquering overlord. I like all this stuff. And there's a lot of fluff about what is the job of a fighter, which I think actually, I think, 3rd edition did a pretty good job with this. I think 4th edition did it better. What we should have here is maybe less fluff and more about choose this class if you want to play D&D like this. If you want to play a character who is A, B, and C, choose a fighter. Choose a fighter if you want a character who is X, Y, and Z. Whereas here, it's more abstract and more narrative, right? Here's like what stats are important to your character. Obviously, fighters can be of any alignment, religion, background, stuff like that. Here's where we get into it. First, you can see immediately, by the way, that fighters, one of their big deals is bonus feats. They get tons of feats. So a human fighter is the king of feats. You're going to be getting tons and tons of feats. Also, for the first time, notice saving throws have changed. This isn't unique to the fighter. Instead of there being, I think there were 5 different saving throws, and they had crazy names like this one saving throw was for paralyzation, poison, and paralyzation, petrification, and poison. And then there was another one just for dragon breath. And there was another saving throw just for making a death saving throw, right? So they were super, super situational. But here, they're a lot more sensible and abstracted. You're either making a fortitude save, poison, for instance. Even still, 15 years after the last time I played this game, I can still kind of intuit what these are for. I make a reflex save if I'm trying to dodge something. I make a fortitude save if I'm trying to withstand something physically. I make a will save if I'm trying to withstand something mentally, right? These are all reactions. They still call them saving throws. I'm trying to save myself from this thing. It's not something active I'm doing, it's something reactive. And there's 3 of them, and this is good design, and we like this. We loved how simple and straightforward this was. Every character has a fort save, a reflex save, and will save in different classes. Every class had the let's zoom in on this a little bit. Every class had a good saving throw, which in this case is the fighter's fortitude save. And it was always the good saving throw always progressed the same way. So if your 5th level character, doesn't matter what your class was, your good save at 5th level was always +4. And then you had 2 what we call bad saves, right? So whatever those 2 saves were at 5th level, they were always +1. So you were just moving these columns around under fort, reflex, and will. We thought that was great design. So you look at this chart and you see, well, the fighter gets is really good attack bonus and bonus feats. So like I said, the human fighter is the king of feats. And you look at the list, here are my special abilities. I get extra feats. I get really good with a weapon. I can take weapon specialization. I get to choose a weapon and I get bonuses to damage with it. And that's it. The fighter doesn't get much. The fighter is the class for just want to swing my sword and be super good at combat, and feats are how you do that. Feats are how you customize your fighter, and a human fighter would have lots of cool feats. So you compare how simple it is to make a class really versatile and powerful, just give them a lot of feats, with a druid. Look at all the different abilities a druid gets. Druids get spells, druids get an animal companion, woodland stride, trackless step. All of these are special class abilities. They get resist nature's lure, a bonus to saving throws against spell-like ability of Fey, right? Monsters now had categories, which is very useful. You get wild shape, venom immunity, all sorts of a timeless body. I think monks got something like this too. So the druid making druid special involve all this crazy stuff. Making a fighter special, you just get bonus feats. And that's all it takes, because there are lots of different feats. Each feat is like one of these abilities, and that's pretty cool. It would be impossible to go over every single innovation and change they made to 3rd edition. That's why I wanted this series of videos to be just about making a character, viewing the history of the game through character creation, always making a human fighter. So we've talked about skills. We'll look at the skill list in a second. We talked about the base attack bonus, and now the saving throws. There's only 3 of them, and they're totally sensible, and they just unify everything. They unified the stats so that even something as simple as your stats is now more simple and more straightforward, -4 to +4 for all of them. And the impact of this was just, you can't overstate how important this was. It was fun. We loved it. I was running several different games. I had a home game. I had 2 different games I was running at work. I had friends in LA that I would run D&D for at the same time. It was the most robust version of the game, but that robustness came with a price. They did kind of go overboard. They made it, I think, too robust. There's too much detail, and a lot of the stuff in here didn't seem noodly and weird at the time, but it would come to be seen as restrictive and kind of over the top. And I'm going to show you what I mean. We are going to make a fighter in this edition of the game. We're going to make Duncan the 8th, I think. It's funny because these videos tend to be pretty long, but actually making a character never takes that long, and I don't think this is going to be any exception. Mostly we spend our time just talking about the history of the game and how we ended up at each edition. It might be fun to go back after this and make a supercut of just the actual character creation parts so you could watch each one right in serial. So this is, I believe, it's Duncan the Eighth, who has inherited all of the dope gear from his parents. He is a human. And he is a fighter 1. Oh, actually, class and level. This is interesting. Total level, XP. He has no XP yet. So I'm going to add, I guess, class here. Fighter. Here we go. Third edition was, we might as well talk about this now. Third edition was the first edition that made multi-classing viable and actually easy and fun. Previous editions handled multi-classing in very weird and confusing ways. But here now, for the first time, when you leveled up, you could pick any class and take a level in that class. And the weird thing was that you would get all of the cool first level stuff, the typical signature abilities of that class. So there was a push among a lot of players to sort of collect first levels. Right, because you would get all of these unique class abilities, and you would see in 5th edition a response to that where you don't get a lot of your signature class abilities until 3rd level. So it's actually quite a lot. It's a huge investment in 5th edition to collect signature class abilities. And also it put an emphasis on that idea that your character is not your character sheet. Your character sheet is an imperfect translation of this personality, this person in the secondary world, because you would have this amalgam of different class levels, and all of them, every choice you made was trying to further some idea, some fictional idea of who your character was in your head. And your class levels sort of became this menu you were choosing from. You were picking from this menu, and each selection got you closer to your ideal. You know, there was a difference between multi-classing and dual classing, and now that distinction is completely lost to me. It's been so long since I cared about any of that stuff. So this is a level 1 character. He needs 1,000 XP to get to 2nd level. He currently has 0. Here where it says skill ranks total. How many total skill ranks does he have? Well, we don't really know yet, because according to the PDF here, his skill points at 1st level are equal to 2 plus his int modifier. That's probably going to be 0, but we don't know. We'll find out. It could roll really well, times 4. So if the int modifier ends up being 0, he ends up with 8 skill points he can spend, but we don't know yet because we haven't rolled those stats. So we're a 1st level fighter. It says fighter 1. Now we're going to determine our stats. We roll 4 6-sided dice and we drop the lowest, and our first roll is 6 and 4 is 10 and 5 is 15. So that'll be a 15, and I don't know where we'll put that. Probably con, maybe dexterity, because certainly our best stat is going to go in strength, and that much hasn't changed. 6 and 2 is 8 and 5 is 13. So that's a 15 and a 13. And then, ooh, this is not awesome. This is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And let's see what else. But that's probably a -1 or a -2 to our modifier. Here we have 13, which is, I believe, a +1. So I'm pretty sure we're going to qualify and not have to re-roll, not have to use the mulligan. Yep, here we go. There's another 13, and I believe this is our last roll. Ooh, not bad. Another 15, it looks like. This is actually quite a viable fighter. He has Duncan the Eighth has pretty decent stats. We're going to put we have got a couple of 15s here, and we're going to put one of our 15s in strength, and that gets us a +2 to hit and a +2 to damage. And let's assume that we want hit points. So we're going to put our second 15 in our constitution, and that'll modify our HP. And let's put our next best stat in dex. Our next best stat is a 13. And actually, it looks like we have a couple of 13s. We have a 13 from this stat here, a 13 from this stat here, and a 13 from this stat here. So we have 3 13s. So let's give him a few skills. Let's not make him stupid. And let's make him kind of wise. And then that only leaves our one bad stat, our 7 in charisma. And remember, that doesn't mean so it's -2. So right out of the gate, 100% Duncan the Eighth is a viable character. His total bonus is way higher than +0. He's got a couple of stats that are higher than 13. So this is actually a pretty good starting character. Since he's a human, his speed is 30 feet. We can go in the combat tab here, and we have our base speed is 30. And of course, armor can modify that. All sorts of stuff can modify that. And you'll see here, we've got our armor class. We'll add armor to this, and they'll figure it out. And there were 3 different armor classes, your normal armor class, and then your flat-footed AC, which is at the first, if you're surprised, and all they're trying to do, all the enemy has to do is hit you based on your armor, and your dex isn't working yet because you're not alert to what's going on and can't react. You can't use your dexterity to increase your armor class. And there's also the opposite. What is your touch AC? What is your armor class? Only dexterity. And at some point we realized, do we need all of these when we've got a reflex save, for instance? We liked how much detail there was and how well thought out it was. And that, yeah, you have your normal armor class, which is based on what armor you're wearing plus how dexterous are you. But then there are certain scenarios where you're not even aware there's anything to defend against, so your dex isn't helping you. And another one where all they need to do is touch you, so it doesn't matter what armor you're wearing. All that matters is your dex. That makes total sense to me. In fact, there are probably some of you watching this that are like, I like that idea. Why don't we bring that back? All of these decisions that years later, after we've been playing so much, started to weigh on us, they all sounded really, really good when we first heard about this. So Duncan is a human. So what racial traits does he get for being a human? Let's check it out. Remember, I believe he just gets an extra feat, and he can multi-class into anything. He gets extra skill points. And we can figure out what his skill points are too. So we can say extra feat right here. And we'll give him 4 extra skill points, extra skill points. In fact, while we're here, why don't we figure out what his skill points are now that we know that his int modifier is 1, that is 2, plus 1 is 3, times 4 is 12, plus an extra 4. That's pretty good. That's 16 skill points he gets. And we write that over here. Total skill points, I believe, is 16. And let's see, he's got favorite class, any languages. Let's give him a couple languages. Where do we write that? Here, we'll add some languages here. I don't know how many languages how many languages does he speak? I'm pretty sure his number of languages is equal to I think it's 1 plus his intelligence modifier, which in this case would be 2. And so he gets 2 languages, and automatically he starts with common, and then he can speak any other language. So let's give him common and dwarven. That sounds reasonable. Languages. Here we go. Common and dwarven. And let's figure out what skills he has. This is the list of, look how long this list is compared to 5th edition. This is the list of all the skills in the game. So from almost any point of view, almost any other edition before this or after this, 3rd edition was the most skill based. It had the most skills, and skills covered a broader array of things to do. So the fighter's class skills are climb, that makes sense, craft, because you would expect fighters to be able to make weapons and armor and stuff like that, or anything else. Handle animal, that makes sense. Jump, which is strength based. Ride, swim. That's, it's a pretty limited list compared to other classes, but there's a nice wide array of things to do there. So it's climb, craft, handle animal, jump, ride, and swim. Climb, well, where do we put this? Climb, handle animal, jump, ride, swim. Did I miss one? Craft. That's right. Where is craft? The interesting thing is I can't find craft on this list, and I'm not sure why. It may be because these rules in Fantasy Grounds are the 3.5 rule set, and they may have deprecated the craft skill. I'm not sure why, but just remember that Duncan the 8th, if we were playing strict 3rd edition and not 3.5, would have the craft skill. And now we're going to spend points, and there's a limit to how many points we can put into any one skill, which forces you to sort of spread your skills out. At first level, the max skill ranks is 4, and we have 16 points to spend. So we could put 4 points in 4 skills, but let's see, let's spread them out a little bit. Let's give Duncan 2 ranks in climb, and let's see, 2 ranks in handle animal, And let's give him 2 in all of the base skills that he should have and see where that leaves us. Swim, yeah, he should be able to swim, and he can ride, and he can jump, and he can handle animal, and he can climb. As 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So we have 6 skills left. Let's focus in on the really physical ones. Climb and jump, and let's say swim. So now that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. He has 3 points left to spend. Let's spend some points on some non-fightery things. Like, let's imagine that he wants to offset some of his penalty to charisma and sort of get good at diplomacy. That's very much a Matt Colville thing. So I'm going to put 3 points in here and see what happens. I was trying to get a half rank out of there, but apparently it rounded. So yeah, here we go we've got a total of +1. So we have successfully offset our normal -2 from our stat. But it may be that this software is expecting me to do the math and know that it would cost 6 points to get 3 ranks. So that it may not actually show me half ranks and stuff like that. But that was one of the weird noodly things about 3rd edition skills, is the idea of half ranks. At the time, made total sense to us, but very quickly I started to get frustrated with having half points left over. And so now at this point, I feel like, we're most of the way done. I remember that making higher level characters would often be a pain in the butt because you had to spend skill points on a level by level basis, right? Because you couldn't just start with a big pool of points at 7th level, figure out the math, how many points do I start with, and just spend them all, because you could very easily accidentally end up with an illegal character who spent more than the number of legal ranks at a given level. So let's see, what else is there to deal with? What are our abilities? Remember, our class abilities for a fighter are just more feats. So we get one feat, I believe, for being a 1st level character. We get another feat for being a human, and we're going to get another feat for being a fighter. I'll write down bonus feat here, which means we get 3 feats. So, that's funny. I've only got 2 feats. Human fighters must be weird. Let's check out what the different feats are that we might have access to. Here's the list. I believe this is probably from 3.5, but I think this is probably close to the actual original list. These are the core. Obviously they would come out with hundreds and hundreds of different feats in all of these different books, but this was probably the main way you customized your character. So far, Duncan doesn't have, apart from his weapon proficiencies, which we'll cover, his racial abilities and his class abilities for a fighter, they just amount to you get extra feats. So feats must be a big deal, and they were pretty big, and they could do all sorts of nonsense. Like you could brew potions. This is how you would craft magic items. 3rd edition was the first edition of the game that made it easy and obvious to craft magic items. But the weird thing was you had to spend your XP to do it. XP became a resource you spent. You could lose experience points based on the magic items you had crafted, which is kind of weird, right? Remember that we had that earlier edition idea that different classes would level up at different rates, that if I handed out 5,000 XP to everybody, 5,000 XP might get a fighter to 5th level, but a wizard only to 3rd level. And that was super weird. And they fixed that by saying, nope, all classes use the same XP progression. And then they sort of went back and it's through kind of a backdoor way re-implemented spellcasters mostly, because, are fighters going to brew potions? Probably not, but maybe, but probably not. It's mostly the spellcasters who are going to be taking the magic item creation feats, because I think you had to know, you didn't have to know certain spells. You had to have access to certain spells. So somebody in the party had to know the spell that you were putting into the potion, and then you burned your XP. So your XP was treated differently than everybody else's. And at the time, once again, every time I say this, it's gonna sound repetitive, but this is the truth. When we got these rules, we loved this stuff. It was only later on that we were like, does it make sense that I'm burning my XP? Are all the classes doing that? No, just me, the wizard, or just me, the priest? That's strange. And there's, a different feats for crafting different classes of item. But the classic, fighter feats are things like cleave, right? I don't know. Do they still have cleave? I don't use feats anymore. In fact, the reason I don't use feats anymore is because of my experience with 3rd edition, and that more so than almost anything else, players were chasing after these feats, and they were not in any way tied to anything you did during the game. And I missed that AD&D era where when you looked at your character sheet, most of your cool abilities came from your magic items. And those were things you found in dungeons. So your character's history, all the cool stuff you did, was written and recorded on your character sheet in the process of adding magic items. So I do think that that was too far in one direction, right? I do like the idea that you should be able to make choices and be able to customize your character. And 3rd edition had a pretty good balance between magic items that were really powerful and pretty common and this kind of character creation stuff. But in later editions, 4th edition and 5th edition, I certainly felt like the magic item economy was greatly depressed in favor of stuff like this. And so me saying no feats is my way of trying to balance that out. Cleave, super popular. We'll give this guy Cleave. Cleave is, if you drop a target, if you reduce an enemy to 0 hit points, you get a free attack. And this is the 3.5 version where you do not get an extra 5-foot step, which was a thing they implemented in 3rd edition for the first time. The idea that there was a special kind of movement, which is just moving one space or moving one square. And that in certain situations, it was free. You could just do it. Well, in the original 3rd edition version, there was no limitation to this. So you could, in 6 seconds, your fighter could move from New York to Los Angeles, as long as every 5 feet there was a 1 hit point dude you could attack. You would automatically drop him to 0 hit points because it's 1 hit point would be your minimum damage, and you could take a 5-foot step. So that kind of like backdoor teleportation they got rid of in 3.5. So Cleave is a very popular feat, and some of the feats that a new player would take, this is a big part of the design of 3rd edition, which we didn't notice at the time, but we would end up not being super happy about. One of the big parts of the design of this is some of these feats are just better than others. And that is a principle called system mastery. System mastery was a big part of the design in the 1970s. I played lots of like Avalon Hill and SPI games that featured system mastery as a premise of the design, where the idea is some of these are obviously better than others if you know the game. If you have mastered this game, you know which are what they would come to call the feat traps. And I think they tried to pull them out for 3.5. And there were feats that just gave you extra hit points, right? But there were better and easier ways. So you would look at this feat and it would say, hey, you get bonus hit points when you take this feat in every level thereafter. But there were way better ways in the game to get extra hit points. And there were feats that were more useful. And I always imagined that there could be like a feat economy, and you could have feats that were worth different points, and you got a certain number of points to spend. So you could have a feat that, wasn't that exciting, but it was pretty cheap. And then other feats that were obviously really, really good, and they were more expensive. But that would be a very kind of 3rd edition solution, right? Let's have points and let's make it even more complex. So yeah, you would choose these feats when you first started playing 3rd edition. And then as you played, you're like, this isn't that good. Now that I've learned this system, now that I've mastered this system, I don't make those mistakes. And that's how you differentiate the experienced player from the novice player. And system mastery is something that is supposed to make the experienced player feel good about all the time they've invested in this game. I invested time in this game, and I am rewarded by knowing which feats are quote unquote the bad ones, and I don't take those anymore. But that kind of punish the new player design, I don't think anybody works that way anymore. We've moved beyond that principle, but I still see it in video games every once in a while. And you'd have feats that unlocked other feats. That's a very video game kind of thing. The idea of one ability unlocking another. People would accuse 4th edition of being very video gamey, but I think that is very off base. And here, once you have Great Cleave, there's no limitation to how many cleaves, how many cleave attacks you get each round. And notice here it says one of the prerequisites, not only do you have to have a 13 strength, you have to have cleave, obviously. You have to have power attack. We'll go grab that. And you have to have a base attack bonus of +4, which meant a fighter could take Great Cleave at 4th level, but other classes would have to wait. Because remember from a little bit earlier in this video, different classes got base attack bonus at different levels. And this was their way of level restricting feats. So you stopped characters just out of the gate from having really powerful feats. But let's definitely grab Power Attack. I think Power Attack is still in the game, actually. I don't remember because, again, I'm not familiar with 5th edition feats. But Power Attack is the ability to, when you're fighting a big monster, 3rd edition, I think, was the beginning of the principle, which I think is quite sound, that big monsters have more hit points and are easier to hit, right? So if it's a really big monster and you know, oh, this thing's it's so big, I can't miss, then I don't need all of my really powerful attack bonus. Let's trade it for some damage bonus, right? Power Attack makes it so I do more damage if I know I'm going to hit ahead of time. So let's give him Power Attack, which is very common for fighters to have. And what else shall we give him? Obviously, we don't want, Quicken Spell, but what about Precise Shot? What does that do? Well, Precise Shot is a unlocked by point blank shot, no penalty for shooting into melee. This is important. We're going to talk about this in a second. So let's look up point blank shot. You get a bonus if you're making a ranged attack with somebody within 30 feet. You know what? I like the idea that Duncan, there are lots of feats that would be very useful for him. Feats like Iron Will that give him a bonus to will save. A fighter's going to need this, right? Because his will save is probably going to be low. So it would make sense to do that. There are a lot of feats here that would make total sense. But I like the idea that Duncan could be, a sword wielder or switch to a bow or some kind of thrown weapon. So let's give him point blank shot, and that is his 3rd feat. But look at some of the things we passed over. Improved trip, right? This is one of those feats. There's a bunch of these. Isn't there like an improved grapple too around here somewhere? Yep. Here's improved grapple. So this was the first time in D&D where you had really robust rules for maneuvers. They didn't really call them maneuvers. They were just other things you could do in combat. You could push somebody, you could try to grapple. Anybody could try to grapple somebody. Anybody could try to trip somebody. But the design behind this was very weird. It made sense at the time, but it was very weird in practice. Because if you tried to trip somebody just using the rules in the player's handbook, or if you tried to grapple somebody just using the rules in the player's handbook, it was very likely that you were going to fail. There were rules for it, but when you read them, you're like, oh, gosh, based on these rules, I'm gonna have to make a roll, and I don't have any of the things you need to do well at this, so I'm probably gonna fail. Then you would find these feats and you'd go, oh, now I get a bonus on my grapple checks and there's no attack of opportunity. Oh, now I get a bonus on my trip attempts and there's no attack of opportunity when I do it. Attacks of opportunity, which were a very popular house rule, although they had different names at different tables, are now codified for the first time in 3rd edition. The idea that if you just walk past me and I'm, a melee fighter, I'm going to smack you. You don't get just to walk past me for free, right? You've got to be careful moving past me. I'm a melee attacker. And so the original rules for attacks of opportunity were much more complex than the rules that we're dealing with now. And you would discover reading these feats that actually the tripping, grappling, all that stuff were trying to disarm an enemy. You were likely to fail. Taking the feat just gave you an even chance, right? You would usually have to take several feats before you could really grapple someone and make it an effective way to fight somebody. And you probably had to be a half orc and you probably had to be a monk in order to make grappling a really viable thing to do in combat. So this is one of those things where you look at it and you're like, this all makes sense. The rules in the book for grappling are 1,600 words long. They're crazy, but every step of the way, you're like, yep, that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. This all makes sense to me. But 4th edition would simplify it down to a single paragraph. And it was like, oh my God, thank God. Thank God they've abandoned this unbelievably robust design. We liked it when it came out, but we got pretty sick of it after a little while. So you have all of these cool things you can do in combat. You can try to break someone's weapon, sundering them. You can try to disarm them. That stuff's all great. But when you read it, you're like, actually, this isn't very likely to work. Or you would try it and you'd be like, this is a lot of language, really long rules to explain how to grapple. And then I'm probably going to fail unless I take this feat. So what happened was we had all these rules. We just tended not to use them. We tended not to bother with them. And that wasn't the intended design, I don't think. So you look at this list and man, you really want to be a human fighter because now you're going to get a lot of feats really quickly and you'll get to dip into this list over and over again. And they're really cool. It's probably the #1 way to customize your character. Let's find out how many hit points a 1st level fighter has. Here we go. Hit die 1d10. And do I remember some kind of rule about you start with your max hit points? Yep, you see right here, and I think this is the first time we saw this rule. Each character has hit points, and they are basically at first level, you get max hit points. So fighters get a D10 for hit points, and at first level, they start with 10 hit points. And then you add your Constitution modifier. We would all get a little bit confused in 4th edition because I believe they went to your actual Constitution score. So here we start with 10 hit points. What is my Constitution modifier? It is +2. So Duncan the 8th has 12 hit points. And considering that a wizard is still looking at a D4 hit points and probably or 4 hit points at first level, and probably no bonus from their Constitution, 12 hit points is a lot. In fact, I think hit points and how they change from edition to edition is one of the biggest changes. I think we're going to see I think a 4th edition fighter first level has maybe 3 times this many. We'll see. So we've got our stats, we've got our hit points, we've got our saving throws, fortitude, reflex, and will. We've figured out which skills we have, what ranks in, what we're good at. And we've got our feats. We took cleave, point blank shot. So we got to make sure we buy like a bow, right? Or something like that. And power attack. Can't wait to use these. We're going to be using cleave all the time and power attack all the time. Really, I don't think there's much left except buying our gear, and we need to know what our proficiencies are, but I think our proficiencies are probably like all the martial weapons and armor and stuff like that. Let's see. Yep, here we go. Weapons and armor proficiency. The fighter is proficient in the use of all simple and martial weapons. I think this is the first time we saw these terms defined. Simple weapons are the ones that you could imagine a peasant using, and they include stuff like a staff or even a sickle. And I think maybe daggers are in there because, it's just a knife, right? Basically, weapons that you can wield without any training. And then there are martial weapons, and the expectation is that you can't use a martial weapon effectively if you haven't been trained in it. And I think this is the last edition of the game where if you try to use a weapon that you're not proficient in, you suffer a penalty. Future editions would just make it so that you could use any weapon with no penalty, but if you're proficient in it, you get a bonus. And that's better design, I think. You don't want to penalize people, you want to reward them. We can use all armor. Thank goodness we picked a fighter, right? Because having to deal with restrictions to our gear would be kind of annoying. We can use basically any weapon, we can use any armor, and we know how to use shields. And then we have, note that armor check penalties for armor heavier than leather apply to the skills balance, climb, escape artist, all the stuff that's physical, right? If you're trying to do anything physical and you're wearing heavy armor, then you're going to suffer a penalty. And I think that's a pretty elegant way of dealing with this. And of course, there's a whole other, kettle of fish, can of worms, kettle of worms. I don't remember which is which. There's a whole other issue with being a spellcaster and casting spells in armor, and can you do it and how do you deal with it? And thank goodness this is not the History of Dungeons and Dragons 1 wizard at a time, because these videos would be a lot longer. I don't have to worry about any of that nonsense. We get weapon specialization, don't forget. In fact, let's not forget, and let's add that to our class abilities. Weapon specialization. Weapon specialization. And what does weapon specialization do exactly? On achieving 4th level? Great. Don't got to worry about this because we're not 4th level yet. Oh, look, I didn't even remember this. These bonus feats must be drawn from the following list, and it's all the stuff fighters are good at, right? So I think we managed to fulfill this even without thinking about it. Yep, there's power attack. There's cleave. So we're in good shape here. So if Duncan is going to buy gear, he needs to have some starting cash. What is the starting gold? And it's different depending on what class you are. We are a fighter, so we get 6d4 times 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's this value times 10. So that's 90 gold. So we have 90 gold pieces here. And that's enough to buy some pretty good kit. We could get scale mail for 50, and that'll probably do us pretty well. We get +4 AC. In fact, that's probably compared to like scale mail is 50 gold. A chain shirt is 100. So that's, almost half our cash going to scale. So what's the difference if scale is 50 and gives me +4 AC and chain is 100 and gives me +4 AC? What's the difference between them? Well, here you see that scale mail has a limit. There's a thing called max dex. What is the maximum amount? This is the first time I think we see this in D&D. How much of my armor class, how much of my dexterity goes to my AC is limited by my armor. Heavier armor restricts my movement and makes it so that I don't don't get the full benefit of my dexterity. Scale mail, I only get +3, but if I pay, so let's imagine I had an 18 dex and I was getting +4, even though I got +4 from my dex, my armor class would only go up by 3 from dex because I was wearing scale mail. If I pay 50 more gold, I get to use all of my dex because max dex here is +4. And my skill penalty for a chain shirt is only -2. A chain shirt is basically lighter and more flexible than scale. So even though they both give me +4 to my AC, chain costs twice as much because I get more dex bonus out of it, and I get quite a much better penalty to my skills, only +2 penalty to all those physical skills than scale, which is +4. But I can't afford a chain shirt. And so, you know what? I know this is crazy, but I'm an experienced Dungeons and Dragons player. Even though I've never played 3rd edition before, I am in anticipation of finding lots of gear out there in the wild. And since it's only a difference of 1, let's get studded leather for 25 gold. So 25 gold from 90, I think it's 65 gold. So I've got 65 gold left, and I just bought some studded leather. Actually, I think we can just drag this over here. There we go. So I just bought some studded leather and I've got 65 gold left. Let's buy a shield. Why not? And let's buy, do we want to splurge for a heavy steel shield? That would be 20 more gold. Well, all right. So I got 45 gold. So I've got not great armor, but a pretty good shield. I've got 45 gold left and I bought a heavy steel shield. So now my armor class is going to go, I probably have to do this manually. My armor class from studded leather is +3. The heavy steel shield is giving me 2. So that's a total of +5. So now my AC is going to, oh no, it knows it. It added it. There it is, +3, +2. That's awesome. And it understands now that my flat-footed AC is 15 and my touch AC is 11 because it's basically just my dex mod, right? 10 plus my dex mod. So you see touch AC, 10 plus the dex mod, flat-footed AC, 10 plus just my armor and shield. Armor class gets the whole kit and caboodle and I get +16. That's a pretty good, in my memory, that is a pretty good AC for first level, but I could obviously get it higher if I had more starting cash. You know, some dungeon masters didn't really care about starting cash. I certainly did. So now let's see, what kind of weapon does Duncan have? We want to buy a couple of weapons, right? We definitely want to buy like a dagger. Let's go to inventory, go back to inventory. We want a dagger, and that's 2 gold pieces. So now we're at 43. And, what's my main weapon going to be? If, I could make a weird character, but I'm going to make the character that I'm going to try to role play. How would I have been in the year 2000 if I were doing it for real? And I would want a longsword, which is another 15 gold pieces. I don't remember what 15 from 43 is. That would be 33 minus 5 is 28. So I have 28 gold left, unless I did my math wrong, which is totally possible. I got a dagger, I got a longsword, I got a shield. Let's spend the last 28 gold on a nice range weapon. Why not buy? Well, I tell you this: I'm not buying a longbow, not buying a shortbow. I'm not buying any of these. I don't got enough cash. So my dagger is probably going to have to be my thrown weapon, unless there's some kind of ranged weapon, a simple ranged weapon. Crossbow, even these are really expensive. I could buy a javelin. Why not? I've got the feat for point blank. Javelin only cost me 1 gold, 27. And at this point, I've got my armor, I've got my weapons. I could spend a lot of time buying other pieces of kit, but all this great stuff, a bedroll, all that stuff. And, in AD&D, we loved that stuff. That fantasy of looking through this list for the first time. If you were a new player, if you had never played before and you saw this list, you were like, wow, I'm going to somehow need all this stuff. This must be important. It matters whether or not I have a bedroll. It matters whether or not I have a winter blanket. A block and tackle. I might need to do some kind of we might need to lift something heavy. I got a block and tackle. Let's set it up and we can lift this stone block that's blocking the entrance to the dungeon. That kind of gameplay was a really strong fantasy. But of course, every D&D player learns that this stuff tends only to be important in like the first 3 levels, and then after that we can just assume you've got rope. There was a big deal in starting D&D games all through my life until the mid to late 90s. Whether or not you brought rope mattered, and people wanted to kind of hand wave this process, and then the dungeon master would literally ask, did you buy rope? And you'd be like, oh, I didn't buy any. Do I have to buy rope? Yes, you got to buy rope. You're a first level character. But we're more interested in the mechanics of the game, and these don't really have any mechanical benefit. So we've got our armor class, we've got our armor and weapons. Let's see, do we have our actions in combat? Yep, dagger, javelin, longsword. So it shows me whether they're ranged or melee. And yeah, this is pretty cool. It has my number of attacks and my attack bonus and what type of damage it is. I don't think 3rd edition introduced the idea of bludgeoning and piercing and stuff like that. But it was applied pretty consistently here. I remember that weapons had different properties, and you never found a weapon that had every property. And so there was this myth of the fighter with a golf club bag on his back, and all these different weapons in there that he would have to pick different magical weapons with different properties depending on what he was fighting. That was a criticism leveled against the game because of the way they implemented weapon properties. But I mean, I probably played as much 3rd edition as anybody apart from the dev team, and that criticism never bore out in reality, which, by the way, is that's still true. Most criticisms that people come up with about the game are kind of white room hypothesizing, theory crafting, and have very little to do with how the game is played at the table. But at this point, I think Duncan the 8th is done. He's got a 16 AC. We know what his flat-footed AC is. We know what his touch AC is. He's got 12 hit points. He's got pretty good stats. He's almost certainly going to survive. He's got good will. Well, decent fort, reflex, and will. Those will go up over time. The star of the show, though, really are his feats. Cleave and power attack are going to make him very useful. And eventually, I would say probably by the end of the first adventure, he will certainly have enough cash to get a longbow, or he'll recover one from a dead person, and he'll be able to use his point blank shot, and he's got javelins until then that he can throw at people, and that's it. So what is the big difference between 2nd edition and the earlier edition? I mean 3rd edition and the earlier editions? Well, it's stuff like we're all using the same XP chart. We can make magic items now. Anybody can do it if they take the right feats, although you're probably going to want to be a spellcaster. We've got armor class makes more sense now. The stats are all unified. They all make sense. It would be very difficult starting at 3rd edition to go back and play an earlier edition because of how weird and confusing it was, and it almost seemed to be designed that way on purpose. But in reality, it wasn't really even designed. It was cobbled together from all these disparate house rules. 3rd edition is the first time the game is designed from the ground up by professional designers. Look at this crazy skill list. We loved this skill list. It seemed like a vital component of the game. Every edition of D&D after this would use fewer skills because this kind of went overboard. And then obviously the star of the show here for a character like Duncan are his feats. They are the number one thing that distinguishes him from everybody else. Otherwise, his first level character is pretty straightforward. So the fighter doesn't change that much. It's just more sensible and things are more straightforward. Now, if we ran a combat, like let's imagine we did a whole series that was, or maybe it would just be one video, right? And it would have chapters, and each chapter would be a fighter versus 3 goblins, Duncan versus 3 goblins in every edition of the game. Then you would really see things play out very differently, because now, you always are rolling a d20. Higher is always better, as opposed to earlier where sometimes you wanted to roll under a number if you were making a stat check. We don't have that anymore. We're always making skill checks, or our stat is just a bonus to a roll. This is the first game that was played on a grid. We assumed that everybody would be playing with miniatures on a grid, and for some players that was challenging, and there was a very popular conception that 3rd edition invented the idea of playing on a grid with miniatures, but my friends and I had been playing on a grid with miniatures since 1985. For them, since at least like 1982. So that was definitely something that a lot of D&D players were already doing, and 4th edition would take that even farther. So obviously, if we ran a combat, you would get to see a lot of this stuff in practice, and that's where the differences between these editions would really shine. But you can tell a lot just by making a character and what was important to these characters. How did the designers imagine this game was going to be played? After 10 years of storytelling-based design, narrative focus, it's a storytelling game. What did they do? They doubled down on the dungeon crawl, and the defining element of this character, at least, are his feats, and his feats are all things that make him better at fighting monsters. Is there really, apart from the skills, there's nothing in here that isn't fighting monsters. Skills, this one page right here, just this skill list, is everything else, right? The character sheet is about how good is Duncan at fighting monsters. The skill page is everything else there is to do, including things like bluff and diplomacy and crafting and all that nonsense. So I hope you folks enjoyed this. And the next video, we're probably not going to do a video on 3.5 because 3.5, it just cleaned up a lot of this stuff and made everything a little bit more straightforward. It was not, to my way of thinking, it was not a major revision the way some of the other kind of, 1.5s and like 1976 introduces Greyhawk, which was whole new classes and whole new ways to play. So 3.5, I don't think we'll do a video on. The next video is going to be 4th edition, which I loved. I'm on the record as saying it may be the best designed version of D&D. It was very robust. My friends and I loved it. We played it a lot, but it was easily the most controversial edition of D&D. And if you don't know anything about 4th edition, I cannot wait to show it to you. If you made it this far in the video, thank you very much for entertaining the idea of hanging around and talking about D&D history for, I don't know how long this video is. They're usually pretty long. And as I said at the beginning, there's a whole playlist with 7 other videos in it that you can go watch. I enjoyed making them quite a lot. I don't know when we'll see the 4th edition video, but it'll probably be quote unquote soon. It depends a lot on how this video is perceived. People might complain that it's not another running the game video, but I don't think so. I think people are going to give a big kick out of this. I enjoy making these, and I hope you enjoyed watching it. Until next time, peace out.